Hey everyone. Tony Laddick here. Welcome to Expert Media Show. This is session 2, and today we're going to talk about salvaging bad photos. Now, I have bad in quotes, not necessarily because the photos are bad, but because they don't look great. And there's a reason for that very often, and that's what we're going to get into today. Our sponsor for today is Photo Reboot, which I recently taught. It goes in primarily how to salvage old photos, like old family photos that are grayed or faded or whatever, but it also shares some of the techniques that I use for enhancing images, like the one that you see here in the screenshot that I shot in Gettysburg a couple years back. So today we're going to talk about capturing moments. And I found that as a photographer, it can be extremely challenging. It's likely that you've encountered the same kind of situation. And that is that capturing digitally what we see in real time very often doesn't happen. Photography is extremely subjective, just like any art form. And as a result of that, very often it's not just a matter of reporting or recording exactly what we're seeing or experiencing at any given time. It's an art form. So when we look at a scene, or whether it's, a beautiful landscape or whatever the case may be, it's our interpretation, our representation of what we're seeing. Now, the problem is that in many cases, what we see versus what we capture with our phone, our digital camera, or whatever, is vastly different. And there's some reasons for that. One of the primary reasons is that the dynamic range of our eyes, in other words, how much we can see light versus dark, is much greater than that of camera sensors. Now, the camera sensors are getting better and better all the time, and I'm going to show you a comparison here in just a moment. But this is one of those things that happens that can be extremely frustrating. This past Sunday, I was up at one of the local lakes. It's actually a man-made reservoir, but it looks like a lake, called Lone Pine. So I was taking a picture for Daily Muse, and I wanted to get a sunrise kind of something. And of course, sunrises can be a bit of a crapshoot, especially if you have to travel, because you don't know how it's going to really turn out, what the conditions are like or anything. And this particular location isn't that far from where we live. It's about 20-25 minutes, something like that. And it's up in the mountains. So I took the Jeep and drove up there. I have this little app on my phone that actually tells you like when the sunrise and the sunset is, the moonrise and moonset, and all of that, and the direction and everything. So that kind of helps from a timing perspective. And so I got up there and the sun hadn't risen yet. Didn't look like it was going to be like one of those super vibrant, gorgeous sunrises, but still, it was showing some promise because there were clouds in the sky and all of that. And whenever I started shooting some sample pictures, which is typically what I do, the photos themselves look much darker than what it actually looked like where I was standing. That is if I actually wanted to see any detail in the sky. If I exposed things just so that I could see the trees and the mountains and all of that, then the sky just totally blew out. And so it was one of those situations where, the lesser of two evils, or at least that's what it felt like. And I thought, I'm going to have a hard time capturing this the way I'm seeing it. And you've probably encountered the exact same thing. So it's likely you know what I'm talking about. So this dynamic range is basically the ratio of the brightest luminance to the darkest luminance. It's with televisions, we often see it referred to as a contrast ratio, but in photography circles, it's referred to as dynamic range. And so it's the absolute brightest spot and the absolute darkest spot, and how much of that bright to dark can be captured. So the dynamic range of the human eye is about 20 stops. Okay, just as a frame of reference, this will kind of be our marker. to compare everything else to. So 20 stops, that's about what the average human eye can see. Now, when it comes to the cameras that we use, and of course, there's such a wide variety of cameras, both for photography and for video, that the dynamic range can vary quite a bit depending on technology. And expense doesn't necessarily equate with better dynamic range. So I'll give you some comparisons based on cameras that I currently own and use. So I have an iPhone X, and the iPhone X records about 9 stops of dynamic range in its sensor. And of course, the human eye is 20. So less than half the light that our eye can see is what the iPhone X is capturing. So you can see kind of a problem there. The Fujifilm X-T3 that I just recently purchased will capture 10 stops of dynamic range. The Canon 5D Mark III that I have is at 11.7, and it's a couple years old. There's some newer versions of this camera out now that has a slightly higher dynamic range, but 11.7 isn't horrible. The Lumix DC-GH5, literally it's showing up today. I've used them before, but I have a new one coming today, mostly for shooting video. And it shoots 13 stops of dynamic range, so, more highlights, more shadows. And then there's this camera, the Red Monstro 8K. It shoots 17 stops of dynamic range, so it's very close to the human eye. I don't own this one yet. It shoots 8K video. It's basically the camera that they're using for a lot of Hollywood movies and TV shows and all of that kind of stuff now. So that said, the body alone is like $70,000, which is why I don't own it yet. I can't. Oh, yeah. I'll just go buy a couple of them. Kristen's like, you're not even seriously thinking about that, are you? Like, well, not today. But I digress. So there are other ways that we can increase the dynamic range in our photographs, or basically fake it in some respects to gain that additional range. Because in some cases, it's there already. We just need a way to bring it out. And in other cases, we assemble together multiple photos that give us that increased dynamic range. So we're going to look at 2 different methods for increasing dynamic range in our photos. In other words, in taking what appears to be a bad photo and turn it into something that's more usable. So the 2 most popular ways of increasing dynamic range is, first of all, to shoot in RAW format. So a lot of your higher end digital SLRs will shoot in RAW. Basically, RAW is an uncompressed, straight off of the image sensor capture of your scene. Okay, so there's no compression. Like, most of the time we're familiar with JPEGs, and nearly all cameras, including our phones, capture a JPEG, but JPEG is a compression technology. In other words, it uses averages to decide what to keep and what to get rid of based upon a law of averages. It's more complex than that, but the trade-off is that you get a smaller file size, but you also have less dynamic range, and you really run the risk of artifacting. So in shooting RAW, you're not getting rid of any of that data. So in many cases, even though the photo that comes out of the camera looks like it's extremely dark, in reality, there can be a lot of detail there that you can pull out using software. And then there's HDR, which stands for high dynamic range. And typically HDR works, we're going to dig into each of these a little bit more here in a moment, but HDR essentially works by taking a grouping of photographs of the exact same scene, and they're exposed in different settings. So one might be 2 stops underexposed, one might be normal exposure, and 2 stops overexposed. And then all 3 of those are combined together to create a higher dynamic range in the picture. And it's likely that you've seen photos like that. If you've looked at any of my photos, you've seen photos like that. So each have their benefits, but the approach they approach the solution a lot differently. I don't know if you can hear Taco Cat is in the background meowing. She hears my voice, and now she wants in my office. So raw editing enables you to bring out capture details, as I mentioned, and HDR assembles multiple bracketed shots into one image. Now, some of the newer software that's out on the market, it'll take a single image, break it out into separate images, and then reassemble them together to get a higher dynamic range. And I used to do that manually in Photoshop. Like I would take one photo, create multiple versions of that photo using brightness and levels to either increase it or decrease it, and then reassemble them together again in HDR software. And it actually did make a difference. But now there's software that does that automatically. And even some cameras these days have an HDR mode where whenever you select it, it will automatically shoot 3 or 5 photos rapid fire and then assemble them together in camera, which I've experimented with that. One of my cameras does that. I'm not necessarily a big fan because it gives me no control over how those are brought together. So, Mark asked, have you seen the infinite field? I'm not sure what that other word is. Infinite field lens camera that has been funded. I don't know. It sounds familiar, but there's been a couple things like that that have come out. Like the light field cameras are supposed to be like that, where you can adjust focus and different things like that. But I'm not sure about that one. You have to send me more info on it. So the best software in working with these two different approaches, first of all, if you're working with RAW, which a RAW file, as I mentioned, most digital SLRs will shoot in RAW. Even some phones shoot in RAW now. So there's a couple preferred softwares that I use. Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. It's built into Photoshop, and it does a pretty amazing job with RAW files. As a matter of fact, I kind of prefer it over the other options. Adobe Lightroom, which essentially uses the exact same thing, Adobe Camera Raw. And then Luminar 4, which works extremely well with RAW files. The only problem I've had with it is, for whatever reason, Skylum software, which Skylum is the company that makes Luminar, has an issue with RAW files from Fujifilm cameras. And it compresses them in a weird way. I don't know why. I don't know if it's a bug. I honestly haven't even read up on it to see what's what, or if there's an update or whatever. But in both Luminar and their Aurora HDR, it handles Fuji RAW files in a really funky, weird way to where you can't even use them. So I don't use Luminar for my Fuji stuff at all, which I've been using for a lot of shooting lately. Now with HDR, Skylum Aurora HDR is the probably one of the newest software programs that's out available. They just recently launched 2019. And then Photomatics, which has been around for a long time. It was the first HDR software that I used, and I always thought it did a really good job. And here's a couple examples. This image in the top is the one that I was talking about that I shot on Sunday. And I shot this in RAW on my Fuji, and then brought out all the details and everything in Adobe Camera Raw, and then moved it over to Luminar to just kind of pump up things a little bit more. And then this picture, which many of you have probably seen, is a photo that I took down in the Smokies, right near the entrance of Cherokee, North Carolina. And this is an HDR image that I assembled in Photomatics. So it was a combination of 3 or 4 photos that I took and then enhanced them, assembled them and enhanced them in Photomatics. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to do a case study just to kind of show you some of the examples and comparisons. But before I do that, I want to come over here to the comments and questions real quick, because we have a couple. Mark says, I did the HDR trick in the real darkroom long ago, but not far away. Yeah, I remember those days. I didn't do much with color negatives, but I did a lot with Ektachrome and color prints, Chrome and stuff like that. And so it was a little bit easier to do stuff like that in that scenario, because film had a completely different latitude depending on what kind of film you were using. William says, love the example of including the session topic in the slide footer. A great example of the model. Thanks. And Mark says, the coming revolution in holographic video technology has been given a boost with a unique approach of a Spanish startup, Whooptix. It has presented the first single lens light field camera capable of capturing light field video in real time, and it does it using liquid lens. Okay, so liquid is the word that I didn't understand. Gotcha. That's cool. I'll definitely have to look more into that. I love that kind of nerd tech, especially when it involves photo or video. So we're going to look at these two photos. The one on the left is a photo that I shot at one of the parks down outside of Austin, Texas, a few years back. And the photo on the right is the picture from Sunday, how it looked out of the camera. Now, I made some decisions whenever I was taking the picture on the right. And that basically the decision was that I would expose for the sky and figure out the detail and the shadows in software. And on the left, there was just, because of like the shadow areas under the rock here, I was actually on the edge of the water, not in the water, to shoot this picture. My tripod was in the water. And the brightness of the sky, it was just impossible to capture all of that. So I made up my mind early on that I would have to bracket the pictures and assemble them in HDR later. So I'm going to go through that process as well. But first, we're going to start off with Photoshop here and the picture that I shot on Sunday using my Fujifilm X-T3. So this is the core photograph in Adobe Camera Raw. And as you can see, it's an RAF file, which is Fujifilm's file extension for RAW. And one of the things that you can do pretty quickly on to determine just what is available to you from a detail perspective is to use exposure to increase or decrease the exposure. And that'll tell you what is actually in the data. Okay. I mean, you can't create something like, if highlights are blown out or the shadow areas are blown out, there's no getting them back. But whenever you're shooting RAW, in many cases, it's still there. You just can't see it. So like, for instance, if we take the exposure control, and these are all the basic controls for adjusting RAW, you'll see that in pretty much any software you choose. So if I bring the exposure down even further, you can see how over here in the where the actual sun is, you can see that there's detail in the water. We've got some detail still in the clouds there. So see, there's still detail, subtle detail right there. If we take the exposure the other way to see what we have in the shadow areas, you're going to be shocked. All the detail is still here in the shadow area. Okay, and so whenever I was there taking the picture, what I was seeing with my eye, like I could see all of the trees and the rock and dirt and everything. And I could also see the clouds. And, you know, this is what the clouds look like and everything. But the camera was just, you know, taking a look at that scene with the, you know, with the sensor and going, I don't think so, Tony. It's like, it's not going to happen. But that said, with our software, we have the ability to bring out some of those details. So I can increase the exposure a little bit, but you notice that it's going to blow out the sky. So I'm just going to bump it up a little bit. And then to bring some of those details back to the sky, I can use highlights. and bring that detail back. Okay. Now, what you're going to find is that there, it takes a little adjusting back and forth. So, like to bring out the shadows, we can come down here to the shadow setting and slide that over to the right, and that's going to start brightening up the sky again. So now I can come back to exposure and just start ticking it up a little bit more to get to where I want this scene to be. Now we also have options like dehaze, which will help take care of some of the additional haze in the scene. Clarity can help bring out some of the details. It applies a little bit of sharpness as well. We can adjust the color temperature as well, like warm up the scene just a little bit since the sun was out, and just increase the appearance of that just a little. So you can see just with a few minor adjustments, it's made a major difference in the image. We can tick up the vibrance a little just to kind of enhance the color, the way it appears. And so whenever you compare the before and after, see if we can actually, it's reading the original version that I created here. So let's get back to what I'm currently working on. Turn this. Okay. So you can see how we have a lot of different ways that we can adjust this. And again, it's just kind of a, let me get out of this mode. It's a bit of experimenting to see what you like. Like we can bring up some of the contrast, which whenever you increase contrast, it also increases color saturation a little bit, as you can see here on the left especially, and in the sky you can see it. But overall, it's pretty darn impressive. I think you'll agree that just with a couple adjustments, we were able to essentially reclaim detail that just wasn't there in the image as it came off of the camera. Okay, so this is a pretty cool end result. And then once we've tweaked that here in Photoshop in Adobe Camera Raw, we can just click Open Image, and that'll bring it into Photoshop, and then we can use additional adjustments and those kinds of things to further tweak the image if we want. Okay, and one thing that I've noticed, depending on the settings on your camera, the ISO that you use and all of that, some of these adjustments can introduce noise into your image. And I use a program called Denoise from Denoise AI from Topaz Studios that will strip a lot of that noise out. Okay. And if we have time, maybe I'll get into that because I'm trying to keep these limited a little bit. So we have one comment here. So there really is no bad picture for you. You can just adjust it with the software. That's true to a certain extent. There are bad pictures. Okay. And Williams says, the first case study points out how important it is to be familiar with and how to use photo-based software for adjustment, an area I know nothing about. And a lot of people don't. They're just not aware of what can really be accomplished with just simple software. And Georgianne says, this is a beautiful example. I want to learn to do this. This is Adobe Camera Raw. It's actually built into Photoshop. And Mark says, it seemed to me that when you adjusted or haze, the shallows in the water showed up on the shoreline closest to you. Well, whenever you're working specifically with a haze adjustment, it will have an impact on how things appear. Like haze is one of those adjustments that you have to use very carefully, like clarity, because in some cases your photo don't have any haze, but it will still bring an element of pop to the image, if that makes sense. Suzanne says, wow, that's impressive. And Georgianne says, the one that strips the noise. Oh, it's Topaz Labs Denoise AI. And actually, I'll just show it to you here real quick. Let me, it won't take that long. Let me do a save as test. Save it as a JPEG. And let's do a search. I'm a fan of Topaz software, if you can't tell. Which Topaz Studio can also process raw files. I just don't like how it does it as well. So here's our file. So essentially it goes through with the AI built into it and processes your image. You can see up here in the right hand corner, it's basically a nav bar. So it shows you what part of the overall image is in the actual frame. It will apply a certain amount of noise removal, and then you can adjust it accordingly based on how much noise you need to remove from your image. And so the default setting is 0.15. I usually will push it up to maybe 0.25 or 0.30 on an image like this that has a lot more noise in it. So this is 0.3. I'm going to let it reprocess. And then you can see here that you can also enhance the sharpness and recover additional details as well. Because the way it denoises the image, you can lose detail in some cases because of how it works. If you've used filters in Photoshop like Smart Blur and Surface Blur and stuff like that, Smart Sharpen, very similar technology. And so let me do a split here, and let's zoom in to 200%. Just so you can see the difference. So on the left, you can see, like, especially in the sky here, in the water, there's a lot of noticeable noise, like graininess, I guess you could call. And then on the right, you notice how that's all gone. Okay. It's just completely gone. And so, like, if we come over here and look at the rock, we'll let it process here real quick. So you can really see it in the trees, in the grass, or the dirt here. Maybe you can't, depending on the size of your computer monitor, but it just does a really excellent job of getting rid of all that extra noise that's in there. Okay. So it's definitely a cool software to own. I don't use it on every picture, but it does save time on some pictures that I need to recover detail from. So next, let me close Photoshop here real quick. And next we're going to come over to Aurora HDR. And I'll probably do a more detailed training on this at some point in the future, but just to give you an idea of what we can do here right now, I'm going to click open an image, and you can see here are the 3 bracketed shots that I took of the original picture. This one here. So this was the normal exposure, but I also took 2 additional pictures that were underexposed for the sky and overexposed for under the rocks. Okay, so with these 3 selected, I'll click open. They'll import into the software, and so you can see here I'm 3 stops underexposed, 3 stops overexposed, which is kind of extreme. And then this is the default properly exposed image. You normally want to click on auto align. That way, if there was any camera movement, which I was using a tripod, so there shouldn't be, it will make sure that everything is aligned properly. And then just keep losing my cursor. There it is. Click create HDR. So what it's doing is it's combining all three images together to create one new image. And this is it. So now we have a different set of adjustments. Some of them should look pretty familiar to you from what we saw in Camera Raw. But they also have presets down here as well that we can click on and use as a starting point, depending on the kind of details that we want to bring out. So like this Modesto one here is kind of cool. It's very natural looking. We can come in here and adjust it more. So like maybe we don't need this area under the rocks quite so dominant. We can actually cut back the shadows a little bit, maybe boost up HDR clarity, increase the contrast a little bit more, maybe try to bring out a little bit more highlight in the skies by turning highlights down. And then it also has a built-in denoise feature. You can apply lookup tables, which we're not really going to get into today. You can boost details, apply glow. I mean, there's a lot of different controls here that we can use. Smart structure is one that can really help bring out additional details. Vibrance, there's already some applied, but we could boost that up a little bit more if we wanted to. So you can see that's what the original picture looked like. The original normally exposed picture. And that's the difference of the three combined together in the software. So if we do a split, you can see the difference before and after. Now, the question you might be thinking is, well, what if I shot this picture in RAW? Would I be able to accomplish this same end result? And the short answer is, I don't know, because I didn't shoot it in RAW. So in this particular case, I shot it as JPEGs, but it's pretty impressive, I think you'll agree, to just see that much difference and detail being brought out. So it increases the dynamic range. So instead of it being 9 stops or whatever, it's likely now that it's closer to around 17 or 18, which is pretty amazing. William asks, what is a reasonable amount of time needed to learn the basics of Photoshop or similar types of photo software? The best thing that I would recommend, like I've been using them for years, but honestly, I don't know how intuitive you are with software. I've been using it for so long that a lot of it's just very intuitive to me. The big secret I found is in learning to understand what does what. And the best way to learn that at times is to experiment. Now, some of the methods that I picked up and have really benefited using in my own photos have come from watching other people do it. You know, like going to Photoshop World and watching the experts do their thing with their photos, watching tutorials on YouTube, honestly. So there's a lot of options, and I've taught on this as well, of course, and a number of times on how to use the different versions of the software. So it's really just a matter of starting and experimenting with it. You'll be blown away pretty early on. You know, I'll just point out a couple quick things. Even if you aren't doing HDR or anything like that, like let's say you have a regular photograph, just by increasing the shadow and decreasing the highlights, in some cases that can make a pretty crazy big difference to your photo. Like, pretty amazing. And even this software, Aurora HDR, like you can import an individual image. Like, let's see. Let's pick this image. So this is just a single image. All right. So all in all, it looks pretty decent as is. but it's just one picture out of the camera. It's not bracketed or anything like that. So it's making some adjustment. You can see how there's more contrast in the clouds, the sky, and the fence is brighter. This is a storm that I took a picture of down in Gettysburg a few years back. And, you know, if we choose some of their presets, it brings out even more of the detail. Okay, so then I can use that as a starting point. Like this one here looks cool, but you can see how it's getting much grainier, so I don't necessarily like that. So we could use this as a starting point and then perhaps even enhance it further. Like I'm thinking increasing the contrast a little bit, boosting the clarity a little bit more. Probably denoise it just a little bit because I noticed that it's starting to get some noise in the image. They have polarizing filters. I don't know if that'll do anything or not. Doesn't really look like it. We can boost details more. So, you know, a lot of different controls that we have here that we can experiment with more. Now, one thing that I've experimented with, there is a program out also by Topaz Studios called JPEG to RAW, where it'll take a JPEG file and convert it into a RAW file, and then you can edit it as a RAW file. And the reason why that can come in handy is you probably can't see it in this. Let me see if I can zoom in here. In this image here, because of how we're really pushing the image, I don't know if you can see it, but there's like these little blocks of green in different spots. It's artifacting because of the JPEG. But I found that if I take this exact same image, convert it into a RAW file first, and then do this work, it actually gets rid of all this blockiness. It adds more detail somehow. It's pretty amazing. So, you know, we've already gone from this is the original image out of the camera as a JPEG file to that. Pretty impressive, I think. You know, I mean, we could experiment with it more, of course. The original image that I did with this, I converted it into a black and white. And I don't know if this has black and white conversion or not, but we can easily do that in another program. William says, probably not very intuitive, but that's okay. I mean, you know, the one way I learned probably more than anything else, William, was to just experiment. You know, I wonder what would happen if. I mean, they're digital files, so unless you're clicking save, it's non-destructive. So you can open up your photo, even one that you took on your phone, and just bring it into one of the programs, and just start experimenting with the sliders. You know, like you can come over here and say, wow, okay, so we have contrast. I wonder what happens if I take it all the way to the left versus all the way to the right. Oh, that's kind of cool. Shadows. I wonder what happens if I take it all the way to the right versus all the way to the left. I mean, literally, just play with the software to see what it does. And what will happen is you'll begin to become familiar with how to achieve certain results. Like, oh yeah, that's right. My darks in this particular picture are kind of dark. So that I noticed before that whenever I took the black setting or the shadow setting and boosted it, it actually brought out detail. That's how you learn. Okay. I mean, yeah, there's presets that you can use, and most software comes with the presets, but man, experimenting really can teach you a lot about how software works. Okay. So that's all that I have for this one. Kind of hit it hard and fast, but still a lot of fun. You know, we got some pretty amazing results in a fairly short period of time in working with two very dark images. And so if you haven't subscribed yet, to my YouTube channel. That's where the replay is going to be. If you're watching the replay, you're already here. But please subscribe. I'm going to be doing a lot more content on YouTube. I haven't really talked about my evil plans yet, but I'm going to be shooting a lot more vlog posts where it's me in front of the camera talking and sharing some cool things. I'm going to be producing some documentaries this year, and those will go onto the YouTube channel. So one of my big marketing focuses starting in 2020 moving forward is really building up YouTube and using it as a platform to increase awareness about what I'm doing and my trainings and all of that, but also to really get back to my roots of photography and video and all of that fun and frivolity. Who knows, I may even do a cooking video on how to make my world famous cauliflower pizza crust. My goal is to have fun. I hope you come along for the ride.